Last Thursday, as the 15th annual BRICS summit closed in South Africa, the U.S. decided to use the United Nations Security Council as a platform to attack Russia's president. The U.S. holds the rotating presidency of the Council for the month of August, and UN Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield used that opportunity to again accuse President Vladimir Putin of kidnapping Ukrainian children and dragging them off to Russia. Washington and the U.S.-backed regime in Kiev accused Moscow of illegally deporting nearly 20,000 children since the beginning of Russia's military operation in February of last year. This accusation forms the sum total of the case brought by the International Criminal Court against Russia's president, a case that hung over last week's BRICS summit. For its part, Moscow, which controls parts of Ukraine's east and south, has denied abducting children and said they were transported away for their own safety, pointing to the thousands of children killed in that part of the country over 9 years of shelling by Kiev's military and paramilitary forces. Following presentations at the Security Council by 2 Kiev-based nonprofits and a list of U.S. allies, Russia's ambassador to the UN, Vasily Nebenzia, responded to the charges.
Madam President, on 9 May 2010 in Kiev, there was a military parade honoring the 65th anniversary of the great victory of the Soviet people in the Great Patriotic War. This included the participation of 2,500 military personnel from Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus. The commemorations and celebrations took place throughout the city. Only 4 years later, on 9 May 2014, in just under 3 months after the anti-constitutional coup in Kiev, the fighters from the neo-Nazi battalions of Azov and Dnieper won. The fighters, during a similar parade on the streets of Mariupol, fired at vehicles, at ambulances. They openly killed those who took to the who went out in the streets to honor the memory of their fathers and grandfathers. According to information from local human rights defenders, 99 people were killed and 119 were wounded. Let us also recall that on the eve of this holiday on 2 May 2014, approximately 50 peaceful protesters who stood up in defense of the Russian language were burned alive at the trade union building in Odessa. So what happened in these 4 years? How were Ukrainians able to overnight replace the heroes who liberated the country from fascism, to replace them with fascist collaborators complicit in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Jews, Poles, Russians, and Ukrainians? How was an essentially Russian language country able to stoop to persecution of Russian language speakers, bombing civilian peaceful cities in Donbass whose residents rose to defend their values? And why is it that there was no response to this from Western countries who outwardly advance the values of tolerance? In response to these questions lies at the root of the tragedy which Ukraine is experiencing now, when the criminal Kiev regime, which has governed it, is servicing exclusively the geopolitical interests of the U.S. and its allies, waging a hybrid war in Ukraine against Russia to the last Ukrainian. This regime is grabbing on the streets Ukrainian young men, shoving them into cars, and even without basic military training, is sending them to certain carnage in Russian military fortifications and minefields without any concern for the casualties. And our Western partners are merely egging Zelensky and his clique on. They're providing them with weapons, and they're demanding that this bloodbath continue. Just recently, experts from the Die Welt German paper efficiently calculated that the Kiev regime needs to mobilize yet another 3 million people to defeat Russia. And this despite the fact that the Ukrainian population, according to UN data, reduced from 48.2 million people in 2001 to 36.6 million in early 2022. Today, there are no more than 29 million people living in Ukraine. But Ukraine's sponsors have no concern about these people, for as Polish President Duda said, Russia can be defeated cheaply insofar as, and I quote, American soldiers are not dying, unquote. When faced with these unsavory facts, American and Western colleagues generally say that we would not find ourselves in this position had Russia not begun the special military operation against Ukraine. However, the tragedy of this country began long before, when the West chose Ukraine as a pawn to fight against and to weaken Russia. We would not find ourselves in this situation if the Kiev regime had not begun in 2014 a war against its own Russian language citizens in the east of the country. We were compelled to come to the defense of women, children, the elderly who were being destroyed by Ukraine after Ukraine and its Western sponsors unequivocally refused to comply with the Minsk agreements, which were endorsed by the UN Security Council. Moreover, as we know perfectly well today, for all of these years, this document was used as a mere smokescreen for Ukraine's preparations for war with Russia. Our country, to the last moment, leveraged the diplomacy to address the situation. For many years, we called, including in this hall, for implementation of Minsk. In late 2021, we accepted an unprecedented proposal for security safeguards with Western states. All of these were rejected, and Ukraine openly prepared for the forcible seizure of DPR and LPR. Russia could not allow this or tolerate it, nor could we reconcile ourselves to the entrenchment on our borders of the Russophobic neo-Nazi regime, which posed a direct threat to Russia. Distinguished colleagues, today's meeting, as we know, was timed by the United States and allies to coincide with Ukrainian Independence Day. On these days, generally, certain stock is taken and successes, achievements are highlighted. So what can today's Ukraine boast about? Let us attempt to calculate what lies on the surface. Of course, the main so-called achievement is the real totalitarian dictatorship, which is strengthening with each day, where dissent is prohibited, opposition is prohibited, history is being rewritten, and state policy has incorporated the glorification of Nazis and Hitler's henchmen. We are aware of tens of thousands of Ukrainians who are arrested merely for viewing Russian websites, listening to Russian music on phones, reading Russian books. Everything linked to Russia was declared to be hostile in that country long before our special operation. We have borne witness to and continue to bear witness to a multitude of political murders, intimidation, and blackmail political opponents. Are you aware of any other countries where such things take place in the open? Are you aware of any other countries where there's persecution on religious grounds taking place openly, where the canonical church is prohibited, where cathedrals, parishes, and monasteries are seized, where holy sites are desecrated, and clergy are being persecuted for their conviction? And we have seen unprecedented corruption, which has reached unprecedented levels, with billions of dollars of Western assistance being stolen by the Kiev regime. The Ukrainian media space abounds with this news. Only our former Western partners are able to overlook this, and yet Western countries are seeing public opinion be concerned about the situation, which the authorities are attempting to brush aside. And what other state, other than the notorious Islamic State, what other state openly advances terrorist methods as state policy, taking pride in assaults and attacks against civilians? They're being used unwittingly as suicide bombers. They're being blackmailed through fraudulent cyber schemes. They're being forced to commit crimes in their country. Are there many states like this? And are there many states attempting to falsify their own history, to brainwash their own citizens, indoctrinating absolutely false ideas about their country, its role in global civilization and culture? Today, we have already shown in this hall Ukrainian school textbooks which allege that Jews, the French, the Portuguese, and many other people descended from ancient Ukrainians. What good could come of this historical delirium and heresy which dovetails with Nazi theories of a master race which is superior to its neighbors? In this way, we have nothing to congratulate Ukraine on its day of independence. That would be insincere. It is being used as a blind weapon wielded by the West. It is an unenviable fate is awaiting it, and the contours of this are becoming ever clearer. Probably the positive here is that many have seen, from the example of Ukraine, what happens by the blind obedience to the West and the willingness to compromise their interests for the sake of their geopolitical agendas. Let this serve as a lesson to others, and let the Ukrainian tragedy never again repeat itself. Thank you for your attention.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.